What Ike Allen and Andy Anderson have created at AVAIYA is what the world needs.
Hello, AVAIYA family. I'm Andy Anderson. My partner Ike Allen and I are teachers, mentors, and the co-owners of AVAIYA University. AVAIYA is the creator of over 1,000 books, films, courses, teachings, and other supportive resources. Thank you, as always, for joining us. Our fellow teacher, Chelli Pumphrey, is with us today to talk about healing the aftermath of narcissistic abuse and toxic relationships. Chelli is a licensed professional counselor, relationship coach, Reiki master, and author with almost 30 years of clinical experience. She specializes in working with trauma, adult attachment, narcissistic abuse, and pathological love relationships. Chelli founded Trilogy Holistic Mental Health in Denver, Colorado, and currently serves as clinical director of both Trilogy as well as Strength in Motion Counseling in Boulder, Colorado. She also maintains her own private practice where she offers toxic relationship recovery coaching programs. Welcome to AVAIYA, Chelli.
Thank you so much, Andy. I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah, so happy to have you here. And I would love to start with, let's talk red flags, right? So what are some red flags of either a narcissistic partner or toxic partner, or however you want to look at it?
Well, I always like to talk about red flags as external red flags and internal red flags. I think it's important to discern the two because none of us are, some of us are therapists, but most of us are not. And so it's not necessarily our job to be able to diagnose or identify, is this person a narcissist or is this a psychopath I'm dealing with? But, for the sake of this interview, we're going to talk about what some of those red flags might be in another person for those external red flags. So, if we just talk about a narcissist, there's typically two different kinds of presentations of a narcissistic person. And, with a grandiose narcissist, this is somebody who typically, they might brag about their accomplishments. They might seem like they have this kind of, belief that they're superior to others or they're very entitled. They, a grandiose narcissist will kind of wear their narcissism on their sleeve. So they're not afraid to talk about themselves or, that they're better than other people. They also can be kind of brash. They might also lack empathy. So they, you might notice that they don't seem to care about things that you do, or they can react and be really critical or cruel and not seem to have any concern about how that might affect the person that they're doing it to. That lack of empathy is definitely a big piece of this. So, that's kind of generally speaking a grandiose narcissist. But then there's the other type of narcissistic presentation, which is what we call a covert or vulnerable narcissist. And these types are a little more tricky to spot. And the vulnerable narcissist, they're not going to wear their narcissism on their sleeve like the grandiose narcissist. They can often present as very humble. They might seem kind of self-deprecating even. They might seem vulnerable and want to share their feelings or even talk about how they don't feel good enough, or they might display they might talk about feeling ashamed of themselves or experiencing shame, whereas the grandiose narcissist is not going to talk about feeling shame. And so people can sometimes feel sorry for them, and they often will have kind of victim stories, like the world has done them wrong. It's always somebody else's fault. Grandiose narcissists can do this too. But a vulnerable narcissist underneath has many of the qualities of the grandiose. So they do believe they're better than other people. They can lack empathy. They can also be very self-focused, and they can also be very passive aggressive. So, there's a lot of comments that might come out that, you get the idea that they think that they're better than you or that they're better than other people. They might have a lot of ideas that, the world has done them wrong, but it's always somebody else's fault, kind of like I said. So generally speaking, whether it's grandiose or a vulnerable narcissist, there's just kind of this self-centered, empathy lacking kind of presentation that a narcissist will have. So does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I appreciate you breaking it into those two different types, because I think that's so important. Because I mean, as the whole narcissistic abuse is becoming more and more mainstream as far as like what it is, but I think still people might think, right, a narcissist is someone who is grandiose and who is outwardly expressing, right, how great they are or what have you. But it's so important to understand that more covert type of person as well, because it's very tricky and sneaky, and yeah, a lot of things that you might not expect come out of that person. So if people are in these relationships and they're being abused, they're being betrayed, they're being gaslit, deceived, all those things, why don't people just leave? This is a question that gets asked a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yes, these are such tricky relationships. And, one thing that I want to kind of add about these red flags to look for in a narcissist is, in the beginning, they typically prey upon somebody to have in a relationship. And they are looking for somebody who tends to be vulnerable. So you might be in a vulnerable situation where, let's say, you just went through a divorce, or you're a single parent and you're struggling in some way, but they also look for personality characteristics. So are you really nice? Are you willing to put up with things? And people tend to not realize that this is happening in the beginning, because what happens is you tend to experience what we call love bombing. So in the beginning, they will come on very hot and heavy. Sometimes it seems like you've met your soulmate, because they all of a sudden will have everything in common with you. They may want the relationship to move really quickly. They might tell you they love you within a few weeks, or they want to move in or get married quickly. And not all of them are that quick, but that is a very common thing. They might want to talk to you all the time. So what happens is, in the beginning, the person experiences this intense connection. And one of the things that narcissists are really good at doing is called mirroring. And they notice your gestures, they notice your mannerisms, they notice the things you like, they notice, all the stories about your Aunt Judy and Uncle Bob, and they will mirror these things back to you. And so what happens to you as the unsuspecting person is, oh my gosh, here's this person that we have everything in common. This has to be my soulmate, right? This is my true love. And you're thinking there's all these green flags, and these are actually red flags. So then as you proceed into the relationship, all of a sudden you start to see what the terminology we like to say is the mask slips. So you start to see this other side of this person that you fell in love with. And it's often this very like Jekyll and Hyde kind of personality. So you've seen the loving, kind, attentive side, and then you see somebody who either gets really angry, goes into a rage, or maybe they're hypersensitive to criticism. Maybe they turn things around on you and gaslight you or make you feel crazy, like you're losing your mind. And you start to see this kind of back and forth kind of movement of, sometimes they're really loving and amazing, and sometimes they're horrible and abusive or critical. And what happens over time is a survivor of these relationships develops what we call cognitive dissonance. And cognitive dissonance is a hallmark symptom. And this term, or this dynamic, was identified first by Sandra Brown, and she's an author and really a pioneer in this field. She wrote this book called Women Who Love Psychopaths, and a few other books, but she talks about cognitive dissonance as a trauma symptom of this. And what it develops because you're seeing these two distinct personalities, and your brain, it's like your brain has to decide what is true. Because, is this partner loving and my soulmate, or is this person abusive and my terrorist? Is this a healthy relationship, or is this an unhealthy relationship? And eventually, over time, your brain becomes super confused, which leads to you staying in the relationship. To answer your question, long story short, this is one of the major reasons why it becomes so difficult for people to understand that something is going on here. The cognitive dissonance creates problems in the executive functioning part of our brain, which is where we learn where we are able to reason, make decisions, organize our thoughts, think analytically. That starts to be affected by the trauma. And then it is also very hard to make decisions about, what do I do with this relationship? Right. So I could talk for hours about how this develops, but that's kind of the foundation as to why people get stuck in these relationships and find it hard to leave.
Right. Gotcha. Awesome. Thank you. I appreciate you going into cognitive dissonance. And we love Sandra. She's also a teacher at AVAIYA. So been on many events with us and does absolutely great work. And yeah, I think it's so important to understand that, because it's such a confusing thing that a lot of people don't realize as it relates to why people don't leave and all of that. And you mentioned in there, right, that something about vulnerability. And I'm curious if you could go deeper there, right? What makes people more vulnerable to these kinds of relationships?
Yeah. There's a lot of misinformation out there about this, because I think there's this general belief that if you get stuck in one of these relationships, or if you've had a series of these kinds of partners, that you must be codependent. You must not be able to have good boundaries, or you must not have very strong self-worth. And what we have found, and Sandra Brown did an extensive research study with Purdue University, and found that most women, and I'm just going to say women because that's who was studied, but most women did not have characteristics of codependency, nor did they have significant trauma backgrounds. And that's kind of what the general thinking has always been. What they found was that these women had personality traits of what we call agreeableness and conscientiousness, instead of codependency or trauma. And basically why this is important to understand is because, first of all, codependency tends to come from a trauma background, or you're getting these patterns role modeled in your family of origin, perhaps. And you can do some healing work, you can do trauma work, you can try to change patterns that lead to codependency. But if it's your personality, that is more hardwired into who you are. It is really a pervasive part of who you are and who you will be for the rest of your life. And so if you're thinking you're codependent and you're doing therapy to fix that, yet it's actually your personality traits that are leading to this, you're not going to get it fixed. You're just going to be spinning your wheels. And, the thing with these two traits is that, people who are more agreeable tend to be very forgiving. They're very tolerant, very flexible. They have a lot of empathy and compassion. And this is a trait that makes them very susceptible to getting into these relationships in the first place, because they will give an unhealthy or inappropriate partner a bajillion chances. They're like, okay, one more chance, right? Because they're just super agreeable. And then the conscientiousness part, people who are conscientious tend to be very loyal. They have a lot of integrity. They're very goal-driven and success-oriented. So they are very focused on keeping that relationship. They're going to do whatever they can to try to work that relationship out. And that tends to be the trait that keeps them stuck in the relationships. Mm-hmm. So in general, those are two personality traits that can make somebody very vulnerable. But codependency is also a vulnerability. There's also, I have found that people that have what we call an anxious attachment style, for people that are listening that are familiar with the attachment styles, anxiously attached people tend to be very vulnerable as well for other reasons, but that might be a whole other discussion.